So let's go back to pollution, that classic example of a negative externality. So you have some good here, but producing that good involves pollution as well. So here's demand for the good. And we show two supply curves here. S internal is a supply curve if the firm only thinks about its own costs. So the firm thinks about how much does it cost us when we provide more units of this good. They don't worry about how it affects society through the pollution. S social is this supply curve over here. S social would be the supply curve if the firm were to fully account for the effects of pollution on society. So S social includes the firm's costs, but also society's costs from pollution and dirty air. So the market outcome is where the firm's own internal supply curve meets demand. So that's right over here. You get P market for the market price, and you get Q market for the market quantity. The efficient outcome, though, would not be based only on the firm's cost. It would also incorporate society's costs, so that would be using S social. So the firm gave full consideration to that. Their supply curve would be back over here. That intersects demand at this point. That would cause them to produce a quantity Q star for the efficient quantity, there towards a price P star. So the market outcome here with market price, market quantity is inefficient. The firm is producing too much. That matches our intuition from earlier. Recall we said that if a good has a negative externality like pollution, markets tend to provide too much of those goods. And the market quantity is indeed higher than the efficient quantity. The deadweight loss is this red triangle here. So for these last goods, consumers' willingness to pay is given by a demand curve. They value the goods at this much. So where is demand in that region? The cost to society to produce those goods is way up here though. So the good cost society $12 to make once you account for the pollution, but people only value it at $8. Making that good is not a good idea. You shouldn't be spending $12 of society's resources to make something that people think is only worth $8. Bad idea. So that's creating deadweight loss that creates inefficiency. That reduces total surplus and is harmful to society. Now, this also illustrates the point I made earlier. Just because a good has negative externalities does not mean you should ban it. The efficient quantity of this good is not zero. You should not ban pollution. There are some levels of the good where the benefits, so people's willingness to pay for it, exceed the cost to society. So the cost to society, the S social down here, the people value the good more highly than that. So it's efficient to allow some production and some pollution, but letting the market just run wild with no regulations will result in too much production and too much pollution. So how do you address the market's inefficiencies? So one solution is to impose a tax. This is an exception to the rule we had back in Chapter 5. So back in Chapter 5, when there are no externalities to worry about, taxes were generally a bad thing. They created deadweight loss and inefficiency. It cost society more than $1 in order to produce $1 of revenue. However, if there's a negative externality involved, then a tax could be a good idea. So let's say that every time you produce a unit of this good, society bears a cost of $5 in the form of pollution. So that pollution is worth $5 of harm to society. So the firm's internal supply curve is different from society's supply curve because the firm doesn't care about that pollution that's harming society. It doesn't care about that $5 harm it's creating every time it produces a good. So what they could do is then tax the firm at a rate of $5 per unit. The firm still doesn't care about pollution, but they do care about the tax. Set that tax just right, so the tax equal to the harm from the pollution, then the firm is thinking about the tax. It's equivalent to them thinking about the pollution. So when they calculate a tax and they adjust for it, that's the same as if they were accounting for the pollution and adjusting for the pollution. So now it's making that pollution cost in society a part of the firm's calculations. We call this internalizing the externalities, making the firm care about the effects of its pollution. So we tax the firm at a rate of $5 per unit. That would shift the supply curve up by $5, and that would cause it to coincide with society's supply curve. That would restore efficiency to this market. That also brings us to a very important principle. There's a saying that two wrongs don't make it right. However, in econ land, two wrongs can make it right. So pollution is a wrong that causes inefficiency. Taxes are also a wrong that creates inefficiency. If you put a tax on pollution, though, things could cancel out and the market could become efficient as long as you design that tax properly. So one thing you can do is you impose a tax on pollution to create efficiency. Solution number 2 is the Coase theorem. So the Coase theorem has two conditions. You have to have low bargaining costs. That's the first condition. You also have to have property rights. If both of those are true, then everyone involved can negotiate and reach a deal. That deal will end up being efficient. So how can we be so sure that this will work? Well, it actually comes back to our friend, the first fundamental welfare theorem. So our first fundamental welfare theorem told us that markets are efficient under some conditions. The problem with things like pollution is that there's no market for it. So if there's no market for that good, then our theorem doesn't apply and we don't get efficiency. Or I should say, we're not guaranteed efficiency, if I'm being more precise here. So the Coase theorem is very simple. It says we need a market for every good. We don't have a market for pollution, so let's create a market for pollution. That way we get efficiency again. Now, one big benefit to the Coase theorem is that this can still apply even if the government doesn't know where the social supply curve is. So back in our earlier example, things look pretty easy. You have this $5 tax from pollution, this $5 of harm from pollution. So create a $5 tax, and now it'll be efficient again. Well, do we really know how harmful pollution is? We know pollution is a bad thing, but do we know exactly how bad it is? Do we really have that estimated precisely? Maybe not. The government might not actually know what the harm is from pollution and might not know what the right tax to set is. So making this work in practice is not quite as easy as I made it seem. The Coase theorem, though, doesn't require the government to be so omniscient. So how could the Coase theorem work out in real life? So let's go back to one of our earlier examples where your neighbors are having a late night party and you couldn't sleep. We said that was an example of a negative externality. So it affects a third party, you, and there's no market for a quiet night. So it's an externality. Can we get the Coase theorem to work here? Yes. So we have to have low bargaining costs. That's true. All I have to do is go across the hallway, knock on their door, start talking, and now you're bargaining. That sounds pretty low. Can property rights be assigned? Yes, they can. So, two ways to do it. They could have a right to have a party. That's one way to assign property rights. Alternatively, there could be a right to quiet evenings. So you get a right to peace and quiet. That's another way to assign property rights. Importantly, for our Coase theorem to work, it doesn't actually matter how you assign property rights. At the end of the negotiations, things will be efficient in the end. How you assign property rights will of course affect how well off each side is, but the end result will be efficient either way. Let's go more in depth on that example. So let's say that if you had to put a price tag on how much is a good night's sleep really worth, let's say I think it's worth $40. So a world in which you get $40 or a world in which you get a good night's sleep are just as good in your eyes. How much do your neighbors value the party? It's a lot of fun, but how much fun is that? Let's say I think it's worth $100. So a world in which they find $100 on the sidewalk and a world in which they have a really awesome party are just equally good in their eyes. So we said there are two ways to assign property rights. Let's say they get a right to party. So they hold their party, and that's actually efficient to allow them to party. That's because the benefits to your neighbors are $100. The cost to you are $40, so the benefits are bigger than the cost, so let them party on. So it's efficient to allow the party, and they're going to party if they have a right to do so. Now, if you have a right to quiet evenings, if they have no right to party, then you can still reach the efficient outcome. So they go and knock on your door and say, I know we're supposed to be quiet in evenings, but we really, really want to party, and I know it's going to be annoying to you, but we'll pay you to give us permission to party. We're willing to pay because we really, really want this party. We'll even pay you $80 if you just give us permission to have our big party. You think about it a bit, and you reason, well, if a good night's sleep is only worth $40 to me, that's less than $80, so sure, I'll accept their offer and let them party. I won't sleep, but I will have an extra $80 in my pocket to enjoy. They're also happy about this arrangement. That's because they're paying $80 to you, but they're getting a benefit from partying that's $100. So from their standpoint, they're paying $80 to get $100. That sounds like a good idea to them as well. So the party happens, and both you and your neighbors are better off. So you can see in both scenarios, whether you have a right to quiet evenings or whether they have a right to party, either way in the end, the party happens, which is efficient. The distribution differs though. So if you have a right to quiet evenings, you can force them to pay you to give permission to party, so you're better off in that case. If they get a right to party though, they don't have to pay you anything, so you don't get paid in that case. Distributions differ, but either outcome is efficient because it's efficient for the party to happen, and it will happen after the negotiations. So in some scenarios like that, the Coase theorem applies and can be used. In other cases, though, it's not practical. Remember, we have to have low bargaining costs and we have to have property rights. So think about, for example, pollution in the ocean. That affects, let's talk about the Atlantic Ocean because we're on the East Coast here. That affects the U.S. East Coast, also affects Western Europe, and also affects Africa. So that's a huge number of people, and they don't all speak English. So trying to get them all together in one room to negotiate over pollution is going to be pretty much impossible for all practical purposes. So bargaining costs are not low when you're talking about pollution in the ocean. So you're trying to address pollution in the ocean, you can't rely upon the coast theorem. You gotta use some other solution instead. You could try taxing pollution, like we had earlier over here. So the pollution caused a $5 harm in society, impose a $5 tax. You can do that, but you can't use coasts when you have pollution in the ocean. Another approach is regulation. Regulation, though, is pretty unpopular among economists. In general, we say it's better to tax than to regulate. Why is that? Well, if you tax pollution, that creates government revenue. Regulation does nothing for government revenue. So that's one problem right there. The revenue for the government can be used for some other important things like education. We said that education was an example of positive externalities. It's not free, so someone's got to be paying for it. The government's got to fund it somehow, and that's going to require tax revenue. So you tax things that are bad, like pollution, you use that money to fund things that are good, like education. If you just create regulations, though, that fails to create any revenue, so you're still left with the problem of things like, how do I fund education? How do I fund national defense? Stuff like that. So that's one reason why economists prefer taxes over regulation. The other issue is that regulation is often inefficient. That's because not every firm has the same cost for reducing pollution. So you have some pollution reducing goal. Maybe you say, we got to reduce pollution by 5,000 units. You've done your math like we did back over here. So someone did their math and said, the efficient outcome is 5,000 less than the market outcome. We got to reduce pollution by that much to be efficient. So you got your pollution reduction target. Now what's the best way to meet that target? So the firms with the lowest costs should be doing the most pollution reduction because it's cheapest for them. The firms that have the higher cost should be reducing pollution by a smaller amount because it's not quite as easy for them to do it. One can show, I do show us in my other econ class, that if you set a tax on pollution, then this will happen. The firms with the low cost reduce pollution more than the firms with the high costs. That means you hit your pollution reduction target, you get efficiency in the cheapest possible way. That's the best way to handle this. Now we just have regulations like this firm reduces by 100 units, that firm reduces by 200 units. It's only by random chance that those regulations would happen to be efficient. So that's probably not going to be the cheapest way to hit your pollution targets. So taxes hit the target as cheaply as possible. They get the efficient outcome with as little harm as possible to the economy. Regulations get to the same target, but they do more damage. They can be more costly to comply with. So it's better to tax than to regulate. Solution number 4. You can try banning the good that has negative externalities. Now we know from before that just because something has negative externalities does not mean you want to necessarily eradicate it. We saw it a couple of slides ago, like back over here. So this could has negative externalities, but the efficient quantity is still above zero. But banning a good does not always lead to the good being produced at Q equals zero. Like we ban illegal drugs and they're still part of life, so even though you're trying to get rid of it by a ban, it's not necessarily going to drive quantity down to zero. So how the ban is going to affect quantity depends upon how the ban is enforced. And there are a couple of ways we can try to do that. So the first resort is they can try fining the good. So a fine can be equivalent to taxation. So a world in which, let's say we're talking about pollution, you could tax polluters maybe $10 per ton of pollution, or you could make pollution illegal and fine them $10 per ton of pollution. It's the same thing. Either way, they gotta pay the government $10 every time they produce 1 ton of pollution, so whether you ban it and fine it, or whether you tax it, effects will be identical. So I said fines are the first resort, and there's a good reason for that. That's because fines, like taxes, raise revenue for the government. So you want to try to generate revenue from these taxes so they can end up paying for things that the government has to provide. Things like national defense and schools, stuff like that. So you raise your revenue in a way that's going to actually make the economy more efficient rather than a way that's going to harm the economy. So that's why fines will be the first resort as a way to enforce a ban. There's a point, however, at which increasing the fine doesn't have any additional effect. So let's say, if we talk about drugs, let's go back to that example. If we're fining drugs, you could fine someone maybe $10 million for drug use. Or you could fine them $1 million. Well, most people don't have $10 million. Most people don't even have $1 million. So either fine $1 million or $10 million is going to be the same. Either one's going to just bankrupt them. So raise the fine from $1 million to $10 million, or from $10 million to $100 million, it's not going to have any additional effect. Either way, it's going to just bankrupt the person you catch. So raising the fine beyond all their assets isn't going to do anything. So why is it applicable to drugs? Well, a lot of people involved in drugs are actually quite poor. There's some discussion of this in the book Freakonomics by Levitt and Dubner. It's a popular book in economics, probably in the mid-2000s, I think. So maybe the people at the top of the drug organization are doing quite well, but the rest, everyone else involved, are making very, very little money. They're barely scraping by. So if they don't have a whole lot of money and you try fining them, even a small fine like me, $1,000, could be enough to bankrupt them and the money to pay a $1,000 fine. So if fines lose their effectiveness at some point, then you gotta try something else. So that something else would be imprisonment. So imprisonment's not our first resort. That's because putting people in prison costs society money, whereas fines raise money for the government. So if that's your only consideration, then it's better to go with a fine than with imprisonment. But once the fines lose their effectiveness at that certain point, wherever it is, then you gotta try imprisonment or something else, because your first solution, fines, didn't work. You exhausted what you could do with that. So that's why some goods that have negative externalities are not punished just by fines, but there's also imprisonment behind them. So with all that in mind, does our drug policy in the US make sense? Is there an economic justification for banning illegal drugs? So a lot of the campaign to encourage people to not use drugs focuses on the harm it do to the individual's health. They tell you about all the horrible things that drugs will do to your body if you take them. Now that on its own is not an externality. In that case, the person buying the drugs is experiencing the harm it does to their own health, that's not affecting a third party, it's just affecting the buyer. So that effect is not an externality. If you're trying to use economics to justify a ban on illegal drugs, saying how it harms drug users' health is not a reason. There's no externality there, so there's no externality. You can't appeal to the first fundamental welfare theorem and say there's some justification for government intervention. So if you already make the case economically for why we ban illegal drugs, you have to do it in a different way. And I'm not saying you can't make the case. Actually, I think you can make the case, but it's got to be a different argument than what is usually used. So how can drugs create externalities? How can that harm people beyond just the ones who are using the drugs? Well, it harms families. So if the parents are on drugs, that's definitely not very good for the kids, is it? And you also can see how it has harmed communities. Communities where lots of people are using drugs, end up being pretty bad, not just for the drug users. Other people are harmed by that as well. So we have third parties here, like kids and other people in the communities, who are being harmed by drugs. So those effects on third parties, those are externalities, and you can appeal to that to why we have some policy on illegal drugs. Now, does actually imprisoning people make sense for illegal drugs? Are the negative externalities that bad? You got to do some math to estimate exactly where is S social going to be, whereas the supply curve can be once you account for those negative externalities. You got to calculate what's the efficient quantity of illegal drugs. That's probably not going to be 0. And then you got to figure out, could a tax get us there? Could a fine get us there? And then you got to realize if the fine's not going to be enough, then imprisonment could be justified. Now, like I was saying earlier, a lot of people who deal with drugs are not very rich. They don't have very much money at all. So fines lose their effectiveness pretty fast. But you still got to calculate, is this difference big enough between S social and S internal? Is it too big to be addressed by a fine? So you got to do some math and work with the data to figure out what the right policy would be. So that's our section on negative externalities. In our next episode, we'll start talking more about positive externalities.